So our two speakers today are the editors of the volume. Lori Gruen is a professor of philosophy at Wesleyan, and she also runs the Wesleyan Animal Studies program. And Justin is a HLS alum, graduated in 2004, and took one of the first animal law courses here, and that sort of changed the direction of his career. He is now a professor at the University of Denver, where he is a faculty director for the animal law program there. And he also just recently, last November, launched a clinic that's devoted to animal activist defense. And just this week, they achieved one of their first major victories in getting an acquittal for two activists who had rescued a couple chickens from a factory farm. Tomorrow, we will have someone speaking about that very topic, about prosecution for open rescue, Wayne Sung. So please join us for that as well. But with that, I will let Lori and Justin take it away.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And Lori is, haven't seen Lori for a long time, so it's a special occasion to be here with her as well. We were going to do this in a way where we kind of had a conversation. We would love to save a lot of time for questions, but I was going to talk for a few minutes, and then Lori was going to talk for a few minutes. I was going to start by sort of talking about why we did this book, or what we were thinking about, and see if that sparks any interest or questions. And Lori was going to talk about that from her perspective. And then we were going to talk sort of more generally about criminal law and animal law, kind of themes that are on our minds and that. And then each of us maybe talk a little bit about our unique chapters in this book. So sort of just bouncing that in sort of shorter talk format and rather than instead of like a long form presentation. So in terms of why we did this book, I have to say it was in large part a product of being at a gathering in Mendocino, California, that the namesake of the Harvard Animal Law program, Brooks and Farmer Jr., the Brooks Institute had hosted. And so Lori and I had been working in kind of, I would say, parallel tracks, which happens often. You get kind of separated out into your field. And Lori had written and edited a book called, well, she'd done Critical Terms Animal. She's done a lot of books, and one of which I used in my animal law class. But she had recently done a book, The Ethics of Captivity. And there were chapters in that were relevant to the things I was doing. And as Chris said, I wrote Beyond Cages. And part of what we wanted to do was kind of cross over. And I was interested in working with, as you who are familiar with my work now, kind of one of the greatest philosophers in the world on this issue. She's been studying animal ethics and animal studies for, since I was in college, and I was reading her work. So I was interested in that kind of collaborative opportunity. We were also interested, though, in jointly, I think, looking at this idea that how is it that so many people in the animal protection movement, the animal rights movement, the animal welfare movement had grown either apathetic to or oblivious to the fact that this happened. We've both written books that touched on it, but we were hoping that by working together, we might reach different audiences, that if I could have some lawyers and law students and legal experts listening to Lori, maybe that would land different, and they would respond differently. And by the same token, we're hoping that the sort of legalistic writing of some of the scholars that we had recruited would speak to some of her colleagues in philosophy and humanities more generally. So we're kind of trying to take on this project of how have we for so long ignored this topic that is worthy of debate, and maybe do so in a way that wasn't limited to our fields. And then the last thing that was really strongly on my mind in thinking about the project is sort of counterintuitive to, I think, the talk we do, but an important part of the book, if you've looked at it, is putting forward really the strongest argument in favor of a punitive approach to animal law. And that's, it wasn't just sort of for the sake of doing it, but we really wanted to hear it. We wanted it in print. We wanted it to be memorialized as part of the history of this field. Why would you believe that you should have a slogan that is abusing animal project? Why would we embrace a logic that the best thing we can do for animals is to imagine them as victims of crime? Like, how do we get into that mindset? And I think, Lori could attest to speak for herself, but that was actually one of the hardest parts of the book, both in terms of the authorship and the editing. And the authorship, some of the big advocates for tough on crime approaches, when pushed to put it into writing, sort of balked and said, well, I bit stir about this. This doesn't feel right. This could be a setup. And then the people that were included in the book, we had real challenges in thinking about, well, can we leave something in this chapter that pushes credulity in terms of what incarceration can accomplish, or that understates the racial dynamics of our system. And so I would say that both in terms of getting those chapters in and in terms of editing, it was really a challenge. That was really one of the goals of the book.
Yeah, big stuff good. And it was really delightful. It was hard, as Justin just said, to put the book together because we did want to have a range of perspectives. But it was also a really important and delightful process, particularly working with Justin, which was fantastic. I did want to also mention, if you haven't looked at the book, we did make it available open access. So you get it for free online. You should be able to do that. It's open access. So you can read any chapters. All of the chapters are introductions, which we wrote a number of introductions together to try to set the framework for what we were thinking. And I think Justin laid that out beautifully. I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to say what we mean by carceral logics, because a lot of people have asked us this over time. And I think it's really important to get clear about what it is that we're talking about. So we think that there's at least two ways of understanding what carceral logics are. One way of understanding carceral logics, and it is something that I'm actually working on in a current book project, which is the logic of carceral systems themselves. So that's prisons, that's zoos, that's factory farms. What is the logic of captivity, incapacitation, and confinement? What is that logic? So it's about the structure of those institutions. But the second is, and this is part of what I think Justin was just speaking about, is this notion of the logics or the ideology and how carceral thinking and carceral attitudes inform our social relations. How it is that we can think about these carceral systems in both the human and the animal case, and how they just sort of infuse our thinking about justice. And well, I'll get into this a little bit later, but I think it's really important to think both about the logic of the system and how it's organized, how it's rationalized, if you will, how it's justified, thinking about prisons and zoos and their justification, and then also this larger sort of uninterrogated carceral attitudes or carceral terms. So that's what we mean by carceral logic, both of those things, and we try to address them both.
So maybe I will actually you want to first?
I could go ahead. And so part of what I wanted to talk a little bit about is the way that the carceral logics work in the animal protection movement. So supporting, for example, a vegetarian candidate for political office, even though they're running a law and order campaign, which is what we see in New York City, for example. So somebody who's a vegetarian argues for making more healthy food available to all, having vegetarian food in hospitals and schools, but also locking up as many people as you can, and also, as it turns out, try to kill as many rats as you can, which is upsetting to me. But another one is celebrating the prosecution of people who engage in egregious abuse at slaughterhouses. This is something that we've seen in the animal protection movement. Many organizations vilifying usually immigrants, poor people, people of color who work in slaughterhouses, who do horrible things, sort of being all excited when they get prosecuted and incarcerated. This is another way that these carceral logics work. And then the most prominent carceral options are promoted by those who believe, and this is what I think Justin was talking about, that animals need to be thought of as victims. And the best way to, quote unquote, elevate their status as victims is to bring those who harm or abuse, neglect animals to the criminal justice system, find them guilty of felonies, and try to incarcerate them. And a little bit later, I'm going to talk about one particular case, the Luder case, that I think is really problematic. But in the book, we, as Justin was saying, we try to include people who are of the mind that this is the right way to go to protect animals. And Justin and I don't believe that it's the right way to go, but we wanted to include those voices in the volume, of course. And so Ashley Beck is one of the contributors to the volume, who's a prosecutor, and she says, quote, prosecutors have the responsibility and challenge of pursuing justice in every case, striking a balance between the interests of the state and the accused fairly and rationally, considering what consequences are appropriate, repairing harm done, or at least bringing closure to victims, and promoting future adherence to the social contract and laws that govern a cohesive, orderly, and peaceful society. She goes on to say, these are the reasons I became a prosecutor. I believe in the ideals of law and order and enforcing penalties when an individual's actions harm others. I became a prosecutor to stand up for and give a voice to those who might not have the words, strength, or desire to stand up for themselves, or those who cannot speak because they've lost their lives at the hands of others. I want to just sort of pivot slightly here to this notion of victims and the status of victims. And I mentioned earlier that I'm doing a little bit of ethnographic work in my new project on zoos and prisons. And one of the things I've done is to watch, probably because I watched maybe 80 hours of commutation hearings in Connecticut. And these commutation hearings just started in earnest, really in the middle of 2021. The commutation hearings are not for animal crimes. They are for pretty heinous crimes, usually violent crimes, for people who have very, very long sentences and who were incarcerated when they were under 25 years old, so early in their lives. And I'm not going to get into too many details, but I'm happy to talk about it if you want to, because I'm really writing it at the moment. But one of the things that I think is so important to think about is the role that victims play in the system and the way they're neglected. So over and over again, the victim's testimony in these hearings is really essential. It's quite important. But over and over again, you hear people who after 20, 25, 30, 35 years have had no help from the state in dealing with their losses. So the idea that somehow being a victim is elevated in the legal system, I think really needs to be questioned. Sure, there's a sense in which you can understand victims as the purpose of the system, and if we have animals elevated to the status of victims, that may be a good thing. But ultimately, in the system, at least in the part of the system that I'm paying a lot of attention to right now, the victims are no better today than they were when they suffered the crime against us.
Great, yeah, I'll say just a few things about my kind of general thoughts on the carceral animal law space as it is right now. The first is that it's bigger and more costly than you would imagine, right? I mean, it is a part of the field that by conservative estimates probably costs tens of millions of dollars a year. So if you think about, I mean, it could be an animal law final, right? Like what would you do with $10 million per year over year to help animals? And if you were really free to do that, I think it would look a lot different. I think few people would say, okay, well, I'm going to pursue felony law in Colorado, or I'm going to update the felony law in New York to try to have longer sentences. It's a massive investment. And when you compare it to even just things like, as Chris mentioned, getting activists out of jail for direct revenue, right, which is relatively inexpensive. It's not very hard to have great criminal representation in these cases where we'll talk about tomorrow. There are people on sort of front lines rescuing animals and then trying to engage with the legal system, right? Not to say, well, the rule of law means nothing, but to say like we are constantly defining the rule of law, right? Like people in this room understand the law as a sort of stone tablets concept. That's always evolving, and push back against efforts to impede transparency. You lose ground. You can push back in terms of doing some activism and defending those activists, and you gain ground. So there's this push and shove. And I think that the idea that tens of millions of dollars invested year over year in criminal law is where we're going to make long-term gains has been untested for far too long. I'd also say that there's a sort of paradox or disconnect. If you were to engage with the big thinkers, the advocates in this book, some of the organizations that are pushing for a more punitive approach to animal law, there's often a disconnect between what they would say even in their legislative testimony in favor of bills or some of their statements to kind of prosecutor-friendly audiences, what they would say to academics, or what they would say in this room, or what they would, and that's part of what I think Lori and I struggle with is pinning down just what does it mean? What do you find to pursue? And I can give lots of examples of that. I'll give just a couple of sort of disconnect between kind of the logic and the rhetoric. One is in terms of just the felonies and the longer penalties, right? So a huge victory, we're told, is getting felonies in every state. And now there are constant campaigns to have longer sentences, updated felony law, where you say that the maximum instead of 8 years is 12 years, maximum instead of 5 years is 10 years. There's some of those bills that are pending right now. But when you say, well, what do you want from the 10-year sentence? So what's the goal? We're trying to obtain? Well, we're not looking for more incarceration. So, well, incarceration isn't working in this sphere. Why are we pushing for it here? Why are we spending money on this? And the answer is often, well, it's not about longer sentences, which is a really strange reaction. And if you think about spending tens of millions of dollars to get laws in place that would have a longer maximum sentence, and then in writing saying, well, it's never been about longer sentences. It's rare in law is it to push for something and we don't intend it to be used, right? We don't intend it that, but we don't mean it to be that type of thing. So it's very hard to understand exactly what we want. But of course, we know that at bottom, if you look at the legislative testimony, legislative testimony says things like, we need longer sentences. We need to stop having these slaps on the wrist. We need to do good by animals. We need to do well by them by having longer sentences. And so I would just say that these sort of rhetorical disconnects, when you're looking at legislative history, when you're looking at why groups are pushing these bills, if you say, oh, well, do you expect there to be lower crime rates? Do you expect animal crimes to go down in the state? There's almost always a pivot. So, well, it's not so much about deterrence. Oh, it's not really about that. And I don't know if Lori's had any more luck studying in Connecticut around Desmond's law, but we really haven't been able to pin down what the objective is, right? What is it that we hope to obtain? And sometimes you hear we got to get these people into the system, sort of a rehabilitative type notion. But when you press on that, of course, nobody really thinks that getting a conviction, a record, or a felony is going to help that person, right? It's an odd state to suggest that you get the person into the system and then they're going to get mental health treatment. That's really going to be good, right? That's not, I mean, it's a strangely carceral mindset to imagine the person's going to be better if they have a conviction because they can get some help or something. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that it would be really strange to imagine that the class and race disparities that manifest throughout the criminal system and really are not, they were a little bit more controversial at the time that I was writing Beyond Cages. They're not controversial now for George Floyd and after all these cases. Really not. I think it's probably brought up in all of your first year criminal law class. It's a staple of understanding how the criminal system works in this country. But the animal lawyers have frequently said, but we don't think that would be true in the animal crimes. Which was a remarkable assumption. It's sort of assumption that it would be like bad everywhere else, but not when it comes to animal law. You could wear a sort of abolish prisons button and also an abuse an animal go to jail sort of at the same time. Right? Those things are in harmony. But the initial research I've done, and we talked about that in the Q&A, suggests that the animal crimes are at least as bad, if not worse. Right? That it's not just for animal fighting crimes, it has sort of this racialized background, fighting or dog fighting. Also for the standard kind of run of the mind abuse and neglect crimes, and particularly for the neglect crimes, actually. And then the last sort of general thing I'll say is when I think about criminal animal law, unfortunately, I think about a lot of bad ideas, just terrible things that have come to be. And we can now distance ourselves from some of those or many of those, right? But that's the classic reform mindset. It's this idea that Lori's written about from Alec Perkins, those of you who have seen it, sort of the kind of prison critique literature talk about it. You can say, well, this is a really bad thing we want to stop doing, but it justifies the other things. And so if you look at the list of things that animal lawyers, and this is not sort of fringe animal lawyers, the mainstream animal lawyers have advocated, it's included things like adult prison for kids, right? And this isn't like 1990 that they were doing this, like in the height of super legislation. In Massachusetts, right? A group was arguing for that in briefs in 2019. Right? Saying that this case would be a failure if the Massachusetts Supreme Court did not recognize that kids should be able to go to adult prison when they harm animals. I mean, this is very recent. We had immigration enforcement, that ICE should be deporting more people and treated as the type of crime for which there is no exceptions, categorical removal of this country, no exceptions, because of their victimhood. Again, not long ago, this is in the 2019 to 2020s. We were seeking immigration enforcement. And many of those types of cases, juvenile immigration are under seal, so we can't even really get good records on them, but we know what's happening in some publicly celebrated cases. Other things that we've done include pushing for offender registries. If you've studied sex offender registries, you understand that the social science shows that they are one of the worst failures in American criminal law. They have increased recidivism. They do not make us safer by any metric. And they cause people who come out and are trying to turn their lives around have to they have nowhere to live. They can't get leases. There's vigilante things that happen. It's a really, really terrible part of American criminal law. The animal law field continues to view that as one of the gold standards. In fact, the Florida Bar Journal has an article by 2 animal lawyers just about 10 months ago, and it said the quote gold standard for reducing animal crime would be to have offender registries. But for now, we'll settle for a desmond fall, is what that Bar Journal says. So, I mean, again, this isn't all of animal criminal law, but once you recognize that these were some of the things that the logic of a punitive approach would bring us to, it should make you a little skeptical of something even if it sounds good right at the moment in the sort of popular political, when we're in our kind of group think, oh, this is for animals, they said it's for animals. We should be a little skeptical because in the past, the things that have been justified are so terrible under the same logic of animals as victims. You want to talk about your chapter?
Yeah, well, I want to just say a couple of extra things here about this retributivist mindset and the ways in which it's really understandable, particularly when it comes to those of us who care about animals and watching animals being or listening to or hearing about horrible things that happen to animals. But I think increasingly, and I have so many things to say, but I want us to have time for a question. We've done this before and we've ran out of time, so I'm going to just try to be very, very brief here. But this instinct towards retributivism, I think, is completely understandable, but it doesn't get us what it is that we're looking for. And just last, one of our contributors, Ida Gruber, was just on MSNBC, just talking about the sort of retributivist instinct in the case of sex offenders, and this just is tied with these offender registries, and whether there's alternatives available for thinking about a genuine alternative to this carceral approach to animal crimes. And one of the things I do in my I just want to say I've been an animal advocate for long time, a really, really long time at this point in my life. And so I totally get it. And I myself react that way. Initially, I think, you did that to a dog? But I think that the idea of putting people into a very problematic criminal justice system, putting them in prison, isn't ultimately going to help. I was going to talk about the CAPS laws, but I'm going to not, because I want to say a little bit about my chapter, which is the chapter on abolition. And I want to say a little bit about how I understand abolition and think about abolition. I should also say that I've spent hundreds of hours in a maximum security men's prison and a women's prison. And so it's not that I'm doing this kind of thinking outside of very actual experience with people who are incarcerated, who themselves aren't that keen on abolition, I should mention. So this is something that I'm sort of, I developed in this chapter and I'm developing in other places, but fundamentally the way that I think of abolition is as, in the chapter in the book, as an ethics of care. And I think it's really important to imagine otherwise when we're trying to get away from these carceral logics. And I think it's very, very difficult to do this, given the background of retributivist and carceral thinking. But I think that caring about and for captives, whether captive animals or captive humans, provides a model that can help us think otherwise about what it is that we're trying to do in our search for justice. And one of the reasons that I think an ethics of care version of abolition is so important is because it helps us to focus on the particularities of caring relationships. And that will allow us to do what Justin was just saying, to focus on these racial disparities, these economic disparities, these ethnic and immigration disparities, as well as differently gendered experiences of individuals and those they care for in communities. And I want to just talk a little bit about community, and then I'll turn it back to Justin because I want us to have time to talk. But basically, one of the things that care ethics does is help us to focus on the individuals and their larger context. That's really important. So focus on the particular, care for that particular other, but also look at the social and community context that that other is in, and the ways in which our treatment or thinking about that other can also have, effects that spill over from the individual. And so one of the things that I think is really important in thinking about reforming this carceral turn in animal law is to recognize, and many people who are engaged in animal control are doing just this. What else is possible? What kind of alternatives are available for us to not ignore animal harms, but to maybe imagine ways of changing the attitudes of the individual who harms these animals, and to provide support within the community. So one example that I love is, instead of going and arresting someone whose dog, or giving them a ticket or taking their dogs away, whose dogs are sick or malnourished because they can't afford it or they don't know any better, why not provide food and medical care as opposed to some sort of retributive process? It gets harder when you have somebody, which has also happened in Connecticut, where somebody is involved in causing the death of animals. But even there, and there's many cases of this, there's really important ways in which you can reach these individuals and help them to think otherwise about what it is that they've done. And I think Justin and I started doing this work. We're trying to think about alternative plans, maybe developing different kind of pilot programs so that people don't end up in the carceral system, don't end up in prison, don't end up as felons, and can maybe actually turn to help others in their community.
That's great. I will just, I'll just say a couple of quick things about my chapter and do so. I wanted to start by just noting one of the, like Lori just mentioned, animal control officers. And one of the things that if you know what an animal control officer is, you can sort of think of like a animal cop or something. And so after this book and in the last couple of years, while this book was in production, I've had the opportunity to speak at a few different animal control conferences. And it's really interesting because my assumption was that the animal control officers would be kind of hardened, like think of like a police union or something, and they would be particularly antagonistic towards reforms in this space. But it's exactly the opposite. They are far more, they went into this line of work because they care about animals, and they're far more amenable to pretty radical changes than the big nonprofits in the country, which is really awakening. Because the animal control officers, they frequently say things like, I go to the same area. The mayor announces we're now having a zero tolerance policy for animal crime, zero tolerance policy for animal neglect. But I always know I'm going to be back on the same block, and you really can't get any water from a stem house, one agent told me. And you're sort of making the point that like when they're living in poverty, they're going to do things that happen with the animals that we're going to see, and they're living in housing conditions that are tougher. It's going to be these same instances coming up over and over. It doesn't really matter what city policy or state law we're trying to enforce. It's always going to be harder. So these agents that are time after time seizing the animals are much less tolerant than the groups that are fundraising on let's have a new bill that does this and convincing the world that this is the future of animal law. The animal control officers are much more cynical. I think that's really interesting. I'll just tell two stories that are from my chapter. They're sort of narrative stories to illustrate the range of things that are happening in this space of carceral animal law. I'm going to take it for questions. They're both quick stories. The first story is kind of a dramatic story of like the hard edge of the criminal law, and the second is a softer story, but still really terrible. So the harder edge, I had a prosecutor in 2017 come and speak to my animal law class. So while I was writing Beyond Cages, and she was a local prosecutor, and I gave her sort of free rein to talk about successes that she had in prosecuting animal crimes. And there were a number of great stories that came from it, but the one that really stood out and that I tell is she had a PowerPoint slide. She won't give me the PowerPoints now that I've written it up, but it was a really powerful presentation. And she talked about this one case of neglect that she showed. She said that as lawyers you have to be creative, and she talked about a dog that she had heard was suffering inside a house.
And there was an older gentleman in his 80s who had been caretaker for this dog. And she sent 2 police officers to the home to say, can I get in to look at your dog? And the guy said, no, you can't come in my house. And so she said, but I didn't give up, because creative lawyers always find solutions. And so what she did is she managed to get city housing inspectors to go through this guy's house on a possibility that the house was not up to the housing code. And these housing inspectors were able to come through on a housing warrant, a housing inspection warrant. And while they were in, they snapped some photos of empty dog dishes that didn't have food, and a dog that appeared to be now malnourished. Not severely in the sort of way that lawyers describe, but a malnourished dog for sure. And so fast forward to the presentation, he kind of walks through the legal claims, walks through prosecuting this guy, and there's this slide that shows happy dog, where the dog is like just been groomed, looks beautiful, is sort of standing ready to be adopted. And then there's a picture of this gentleman behind bars, and he's over 80, and he got sentenced to, I think, 4 months. You know, not an enormous amount of time. By some standards, this would be like a fundraiser. This guy only got 4 months. He really hurt a dog. He got 4 months incarcerated. He was over 80. And so then she was tearing up with emotion over the dog and saying, you know, how terrible could it be for this guy who had done this to the dog? And then she said, but that wasn't all. And the supposedly happy ending of the story was that the last slide revealed that she also had the guy's house condemned. So this guy was incarcerated, lost what everyone agreed was his closest living companion, his dog, and he was going to come out of jail, I guess, homeless. Which is really a remarkable, and this was told like not as a story of like behind, this was presented to my class, right? And this was sort of in the height of these logics before they had been critiqued at all. And then the second story is a slightly different one, but of a similar tone, which is, imagine a case where, you know, think about criminal law reforms in this area that you would be particularly likely to say, well, that's not a bad one. The one that I would most often hear about is probably mandatory reporting or mandatory cost reporting. This idea imported from child welfare and these kinds of contexts, right? That, like, of course, at the very least, you need to know what's going on when you report it. But what the mandatory reporting means is mandatory reporting to the police. So a very short version of a longer story is that a woman in Texas had a dog that she brought into the vet to see why Muffy was limping. And the vet revealed to her that it was matting, as often happens with Maltese, and that the matting was causing tendon damage. Maria would have been happy to get the veterinary care. Everyone agrees with that, right? But the problem is it was going to cost over $1,500 to do so. And so she didn't have that money, and she didn't want to lose her dog. And so she brought the dog home with her on this sort of theory of wait and see if it gets better. We've all done, right? With other sickness. But she didn't wait very long. It was less than a month. It didn't have right in front of it, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And she said the limp was getting worse. And so following the sort of advice of her neighbors, her friends, and the internet, which told her you can do so without any questions asked, she surrendered her dog to the local animal shelter. Everyone agrees she was extremely distraught about this. This was not the solution she wanted. She would have loved to have kept her dog. She didn't know the dog was going to need $1,600 vet care. She surrendered the dog. And then guess what? The veterinarian reported possible neglect to the police. And since animal groups had been in the state, the felony law had just been updated. And so Maria was facing a 10-year felony. She was facing a 10-year felony neglect. And she was held pre-trial for more than a month, I think almost 2 months. It was 50-some days pre-trial detention. And then through paying a lawyer, her husband was able to get the prosecutor to drop the charges. So this isn't even a case that would be monitored in the sort of like, what are the bad outcomes for carceral animals? This isn't even a case that would show up because the case was dismissed. But unfortunately for Maria, she was not released home to her family and kid. She was transferred to an ICE detention facility. Right, so she was ensnared in this entire system for trying to seek out medical care for her dog, and she ended up in ICE detention. This is the kind of case that the animalist said, well, that doesn't make sense. So it never happens, right? And if you look at my chapter, there's lots of other examples. Door-to-door enforcement in low-income neighborhoods looking for vaccine records. Door-to-door going around looking for sounds of whimpering dogs. One of the chapters by a person who specializes in the war on drugs talks about that during the height of the war on drugs, you would sort of, there was kind of a joke, you'd try to smell marijuana. If you could smell marijuana, then you could bust down the door and go in and make a raid. And now it's, well, the new burnt marijuana might be the whimpering dog or the barking dog. You gotta go see what's going on with this animal, right? And so I'll end there so we can get some questions, but I hope that gives you a flavor of the reason we've been invested in this project.
If you could raise your hands if you have a question, please wait for the microphone so that the people who are viewing remotely can hear. I'll start off with a quick question. Having worked in bars, whatever, I've seen sort of firsthand how DUI laws and dram shop laws for over serving have had a sort of a deterrent effect. And it's also been pretty effective in diversionary programs where instead of incarcerating someone for that, they make them undergo like a several week kind of counseling session. And I wondered kind of what your thoughts on trying to apply something similar to that, because I think it is valuable. Like if there were no penalties, then a lot more people would be driving drunk. I think we agree that that's not good. But it has seen that the having to go through and pay for even the counseling has had quite a bit of a deterrent effect.
Just really quickly, I mean, it's not clear to me that the laws are serving as deterrents. I actually think that it may very well be that it's the education and the public acknowledgement about it, and also in this case, bartenders, being aware of it. Because I actually was working with a woman who's incarcerated, who this is last year, who was incarcerated. She was out drinking with her boyfriend, who was a cop, who let her drive drunk home, and she harmed somebody in that process. So I don't know that it's causing a deterrent, but I do think that the education may be causing a change in that habit. And insofar as that's possible, I think we both think actually that certain kinds of education programs, so if you think about the way in which the mainstream organizations, one in particular, is spending so much money raising money and promoting the carceral turn and animal law, what if that money went to raising sort of funds for education campaigns so people are aware of what could be different? And I think you're right that the education part of it really has led to a minimization of drunk driving. There still is drunk driving, but I think that there is a way of minimizing through education.
Yeah, it's a great question, Chris. I mean, I'll answer it quickly and just say, I mean, there is a debate right now, and I agree with part of it, in looking at the efforts that have been carceral that are successful. And so one that often comes up, and you're spot on. This one of them is drunk driving, the other is domestic violence. They say, like, look, these are things that were viewed as, kind of family matters or no big deal, and that the criminal law raised their profile. And the scholars are looking at, I think, much like what Lori said, and they say, well, the concerted public campaign on those issues definitely changed the mind. Do you have to have the criminal penalty? Does that, probably the sort of third strike, DUI, do you have to have that? Or is that, or do you have to figure out ways to communicate that this is a serious social harm? And do we have a language other than sort of governing through crime? But you're absolutely right that those are like drunk driving and interpersonal violence are two of the key examples. I still don't know what I think, to be honest, on this is where Lori and I might disagree. But there is a long-standing sociology literature that says if you were to decriminalize conduct, then that conduct would the prohibited conduct would increase. And so that's the argument against abolition. There's research that's coming out that challenges that long-standing narrative, including marijuana use in some of the states, right? So it's believed that once you legalize recreational marijuana, the use would soar. And some data suggests that's not true. So it's hard to know exactly where we come down, but I think it's exactly the example that I would use to say, like, well, what about things like drunk driving or personal violence? We really care about those. And so you say, well, it gives you that soapbox, but is this the most effective soapbox? The criminal law?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is the soapbox. That's what I'm getting at. I mean, I think the soapbox is very, very effective. And maybe there are other penalties that aren't carceral penalties that could also be a part of the violation of these laws. So I think that's, I mean, again, we don't think it's oh, harming animals don't go to, I mean, we're not saying harm animals, no consequences. No, that's not what we're saying, but I do think that, the soapbox is so effective, these education campaigns are so effective. And I was telling you earlier that, as I said, many of the people who are incarcerated, that I work with, that aren't incarcerated for animal violence, but violence against humans, actually find that there's a period of time in which what I'm calling incapacitation, but the distance that they have from their communities, from the triggers that cause some problems, is actually really effective. So that's another way of thinking about alternatives. That is non-carceral. There may not be this thing. You get a felony on your record. You get deported, or you can't find housing, or whatever it might be. But there may be a role to play for a kind of incapacitation that could be very helpful in the case of maybe very serious animal crimes.
Any other questions? Great.
Thank you very much, Justin and Lori. It was great, as always, to listen to you. I wanted to share with you first that in Spain recently, I practiced law in Spain, and recently they changed the criminal code there. And now judges they can choose in an animal abuse case, and not in all cases, but in some cases when the animal is not dead, they can choose to between the prison penalty and a fine penalty. So all the animal movement in Spain was like against this, and they were just very angry that now the judge has the possibility to sentence a person with a fine. Some of the arguments were that now the animals could be in some cases more protected by the criminal law if we consider them as property. But if they are animals, then just with a fine sometimes you can just pay and get out of this. So and then the other thing is like the crimes against humans and against property, they have so high prison penalties. So why now that more than ever we care so much about animals and we consider them as sentient beings and stuff, we are, it's not reflected in the criminal codes or in these penalties. So what do you guys think about that?
I just want to say my first thought, and it's important, I think, to always keep this in mind, is that the prison system in the US is really different than the prison system in other countries, and including Spain. So I think, this idea that I had about incapacitation is an idea here, but it may be different in Spain, because I know, for example, in Barcelona, when we were there, that sometimes people can get out and go to reading groups or be with their children or this kind of thing. This does not happen in the United States for a felony. So this is also really important to keep in mind.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. And it's a great question. I would just say, this is one of the big barriers to change, right? Even like incremental reform against sort of carceral policies are instinctive reaction. Just as we see a dog or a cat being hurt, it's so gratuitous. When we see that the animal crimes penalty is being reduced, we feel like we're losing the race. And I would challenge us all to get out of that mindset. It's a competition for like where you sit in the criminal code, because you're not winning, right? Like the animal crimes are not going down in the states that have the highest felony penalties. That's not true. Like the rate of animal crime is not the lowest. It doesn't work like that. In some ways, it's the inverse. It's really bad. We've done such a bad job of keeping the data. You can't say that sort of thing conclusively. But we're not in that race, right? And if we are in a race, it's a race to the bottom. How can we be less punitive than this? Like that just makes us look bad. And if you look at some of the chapters, right, I mean, we fight against this narrative, and this is one of the things that was hard to edit, right? One of the authors says the criminal law has always been, a finely tuned machine that proportions like blameworthiness to punishment. But nobody that says the criminal law really thinks that. Like the criminal law is not finely calibrated to, how bad is the thing you did to the victim,
to here's how you punish it. That's not how it works, right? In fact, if you just look at the criminal code, then you come to realize that we exempt either by the definition of the crime or through categorical exemptions, like wide swaths of research or factory farming practices or so on and so forth. We know that we are not punishing routine acts of sexual violence against animals, for example, but then we are punishing it if somebody in a drunken state does it one time, right? So it's already the case that criminal law is not well apportioned to how we treat animals. And to sort of imagine that, oh my gosh, if the guy who kicks the dog is going to get a fine, so people are losing. I think that's exactly what we mean by sort of the carceral logic on the outside. We're using this logic in that second sense that lawyers are doing.
Yeah, and just one quick other response that I think philosophical response to it. Incarceration is inhumane. It's inhumane. If we're trying to enhance humane interactions with others, going and doing something inhumane is contradictory in a larger scheme of things. That's a philosophical point, but I think it's really important.
Thank you both so much for being here. I had a question just about what criminalization of animal cruelty does for the interspecies relationship and the value of companion animal ownership, or, especially because, this woman who's trying to get care for her dog, veterinary care is prohibitively expensive. What is that saying about interspecies relationships when the penalties are so high?
Yeah, I'll just say, I think it, just the setup you made, it tells us so much about the way the legal system works for animals and doesn't work for animals, right? In a number of states, there are scholarships for veterinary school if you will go into a rural area and work as an ag vet, because there was such a concern that agricultural areas wouldn't have vets that wanted to go out and work with those animals, right? It's not with dogs and cats. But we don't have scholarships to go into low-income areas where persons need to have matting treated or these sort of things, right? The relationship between humans and animals that is defined by the law is one that creates clear hierarchies, right? And I think driven by there's a lot of there's a deep that's like a almost dissertation.
Yeah, and I think and unfortunately it's getting a lot worse in this situation, given the shortage of veterinarians after the pandemic and the high cost of medical care even for humans and animals. So I think you're onto something really important, and I think bringing in the carceral system is itself going to really distort these things. And I think also it's really important to recognize, as Justin said in the two cases, I was going to talk about the Heidi Luter case in Connecticut. These are people that actually do care about their animals. They're not people who want to harm animals. They usually they're companion animals. It's that they're in Luter's case, she became addicted to opioids. In this older man's case, he was probably just incompetent, I would guess. And in the case of Maria, she didn't have the money. So these are all, concerns, and thinking about those things, I think, would be important as well.
Isabella, then Alex.
Yeah, just a quick question. Does it matter ethically who we're lobbying to incarcerate? Say a particularly reprehensible Smithfield executive as opposed to the farm worker that may just be carrying out their directives, as is more often the case right now?
Unfortunately, those are not people who are brought, who are criminally charged in those situations, and to a large extent, the whole system of the animal cruelty that is the animal agricultural system is completely off limits. Nobody's talking about that. So what we're looking at sort of the margins of animal agriculture, the disempowered people in those systems, and companion animals.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is it's a great illustration of the way that sort of money accrues around a cause or an issue, but it's not used for helping the animals that need it the most. So many tens of millions of dollars, as I said, is invested each year in creating relationships with prosecutors, lobbying for pro-prosecution bills. But somehow we're told there's never the political will to prosecute a corporation. Would I be opposed to Tyson being prosecuted? No. Would I be opposed to Foster Farm being prosecuted? No. But yet we see, I mean, that's partially why I changed to focusing on activist defense, because I think it's, as I say, at the end of Beyond Cage, it's amazing that we think it's animal law to prosecute people, but not to defend the people who are rescuing them. It's like, that's not animal law, that's something that's criminal defense law. But, you know, it's also the case that we don't have the clout to stop those prosecutions through the literature we have, and we don't have the clout to apparently push prosecutions when there's clear examples of, you know, corporate liability. So I think that it's like that is kind of a symptom of the problem of the carceral system.
Just hold 1 second, I get the mic to you.
The nature.
Phil Donahue vibe.
Thank you all so much. My question just basically builds off of the last two questions. So regarding animal agriculture and factory farming, when you talk about care instead of the carceral approach, how do you when we're dealing with people who view animals as a means to an end, how can you appeal from that standpoint? Doesn't the carceral approach more so, wouldn't you think they respond more to that? So then when we talk about the executives at these companies, you know, basically, I just want to know how the approach of care instead of the carceral approach could be applicable to people who believe that animals are a means to an end and that it's okay to abuse them in these factory farms.
It's such a hard question, and it's a great question, and the important thing to think about here, as I think Justin just said, is that our criminal codes aren't designed to stop factory farming, right? I mean, they're not looking, and that the system isn't going to stop that. It's not also going to stop all sorts of human harms that are part of a capitalist corporate sort of production. In fact, the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act is designed precisely to protect corporations from protests against sort of activists, right? So I think that's in some ways a larger structural problem that the even carceral animal law isn't going to touch, because it's kind of outside of that. But to answer the question about whether or not sort of doing something punitive or carceral versus something caring, I think fundamentally that's what's absent across the board, and it's part of the problem with the structures that exist. So ultimately, the more we're engaged in, as I said, the carceral mindset has, we grew up in it. It's an ideology that sort of shapes, how do we escape it? How do we get out of it in our own mind? Well, care is one way to do that. And so it opens pathways. And one of the things that I found in prison, in particular in the maximum security men's prison, is that that's something that they really do respond to. Understanding themselves as in part of their rehabilitation process. And again, these aren't people who did bad things to animals, but did pretty violent things to humans. And the idea is that they, in their process of rehabilitation, have come to see themselves as part of networks of care. And in part, recognizing themselves as part of a network of care, they also can change the mindset, get out of the mindset that what you need to do when somebody disses you, or when somebody's violent towards you, or somebody gives you a bad feeling, that you react with violence. No. So that's what I'm getting at in this. It's to try to change our mindset. Now, factory farming, I mean, that's going to be, I guess I would say, upstream, right? It would be upstream. And I've written a lot about how to rethink food animals, but that's outside of the carceral.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, I don't have an answer to that either. I mean, one thing that your question did remind me of, though, that I didn't want to end today without mentioning is there's also just a fundamental mismatch between how we think about sort of carcerality and this care ethic, because a lot of the animal crimes are not about a lack of care, as Lori was just saying. You know, in 2017, one of the chapters the author writes about Libra's Law. 2017, Libra's Law. We often name these after abused animals. Libra got to put his dog paw on a bill that Governor Tom Wolf signed. It was this big ceremony, a huge victory. in the 3 years after Libra's law was signed, only 7% of the felonies prosecuted under Libra's law were like aggravated cruelty, the sort of like thing that we're like, how do we get under this like, you know, sadistic person? And well more than half of them were for neglect. It's sort of like crimes of poverty, right? And so you pass the felony law, but only 7% of those cases are these really extreme cases, but most of them are, you know, are these instances where there's no lack of care. Now, when you do have a true lack of care, I think it requires, you know, creativity. And in that sense, like we haven't done very well in the criminal system writ large. So it's hard to say, well, the animal system should solve it. But I do think there's a possibility that we have existing spaces of empathy, like farm sanctuaries and the like. And yeah, we're talking about sort of pilots where people might, instead of having a conviction, go and try to learn, you know, empathy training and things like that. So it's possible that we could explore things, but I don't know how you get all the way up to sort of the, you know, taking down factory farms.
Okay, we've got a class coming in at 1:30, so we have time for one last quick question, and if you could.
Thank you so much. What do you guys think about this new theory where it says that to advance animal rights, we should legally recognize animals as victims in the legal system? What do you guys think about that? Because I personally have my doubts that it would be something positive. As you say, Lori, victims aren't really doing well in the legal system. I don't think the legal system really protects victims. I don't know if it would be something positive for animals to consider them as victims legally. What do you guys think about it?
Well, I think part of the issue is that to a large extent, the criminal legal system is sort of justifies itself as acting on behalf of victims. That's the justification often, or at least a good part of the justification. And so similarly with animal law, I mean, I think this is the motivation for elevating animals to victimhood, because then the criminal legal system will be acting on behalf of animals as well. But as I said, victims aren't human, and victims in human cases and presumably victims in animal cases are being used by the criminal legal system to justify its punitive carceral approach, and they're not being cared for. They're being neglected to a large extent. So I can see the desire to have this carceral system working on behalf of animals. But as we've given examples of, and there's lots of examples in the book, it's not really helping animals, it's not really helping people either.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And what I would say is, I don't have any objection, and actually, Professor Still, like in commenting on that, do you really think that animals can't be victims? Like, no, right? I mean, it's like, of course they are victims. Like they suffer, they feel, they are hurting. And so do I have like an intrinsic reaction against them being recognized as victims? No, I don't, in the sense that like they are, right? Like as we think of that term, like animals are victims. But I will say that you can't use that term, I think, in the US, like without addressing the baggage that comes with it. And you know, the histories of that, and Mark Stubber has written about this, there's a number of scholars who sort of concretely covered this history, but the victims' rights term, starting with Ronald Reagan, was always a term that had a carceral side to it. It was how do we justify the sort of tough on crime, very racialized politics in kind of a humane language. And like that's kind of beyond dispute in the US at this point, right? Like the victims' rights movement has always been the flip side of the tough on crime. And so you have to be aware of that when you're using the terminology. Like that's it, like animals are victims. I'll say, well, I'll just close by saying, I think even today, if we Googled it, I don't remember exactly the headline, but I use the immigration enforcement as one of the examples. A headline of a major national organization, I think this is the headline of their press release that was still up, you know, within the last couple of months. Federal court victory finding animals as victims, right? So they're always looking for how do you have federal court victories or court victories that recognize animals as victims. That was, you know, a Bureau of Immigration Appeals court saying, yep, it's categorical. Animals are victims. Therefore, when you're harming a victim, you have no relief from deportation. So, you know, we can sort of use the term victim as a way of getting into that system. And we're going to say, wow, this is a huge victory. We have this person deported. So again, I think they suffer, but that term is pretty limited.
Great. Okay. Well, sorry, we've got a class
Yeah,
coming in,
thanks.
so we have to wrap up. But thank you all so much, and please join me in thanking Professor Gruen, Professor Marceau.